This is the third part of speech perception, and we're just gonna get as far as we can so we can finish up on Monday. Okay, so speech segmentation, how we perceive breaks between words. And you can see in this speech spectrogram being shown here, this is more idealized than some of what we saw with had in the earlier slideshow. But speech segmentation, there's not a real silence between the between speech segmentation, and there appears to be more silence at the p in speech segmentation. So it's a really nice example of the fact that we do not really have silence between words. And I am putting this back up there. This I was talking about it before as context and how do we understand our speech stream. But so if you tried to figure this out, some of you probably did. The sentence at the very top there under speech segmentation is, "The red on a tea kettle often chips." Don't know if you figured that out. It took me a really long time. I tend to go towards there. There donate a kettle of tin chips. And most students go through that. That doesn't make sense, but what I'm reading is there donate a kettle of tin chips. Again, when we are reading, these things are split apart. When we're speaking, they're not split apart, but there are other aspects of the speech stream that are giving us cues to what words are, and that is that we're saying the appropriate phonemes. So the red on a tea kettle often chips makes a lot more sense, right? And I'm going to go ahead and do the one underneath that. Anna Mary Candy lights since imp pulp lay things. If you try to say that really fast, I have a hard time because the imp pulp lay things is doesn't come out the way you would think. But this is obviously, I hope it's obvious that this is a speech stream, a sentence where the speech segmentation has been changed and messed up. What this sentence, if we say it really fast, again, it gets kind of jumbled at the end. This is saying, "An American delights in simple playthings." But again, where that segmentation occurs, we are getting that from the speech stream, even though this is pretty incredible. And I'm going to give you at least a couple of examples of just how very incredible this is, and then I'm going to tell you how we succeed at this. So in this example, we have a couple of clear ambiguities that are not ambiguous when we are writing, but that are ambiguous when we are speaking. And yet, as I'm going to say them to you, they're not going to feel ambiguous, right? We're using context a great deal. So Jamie's mother said, "Be a big girl and eat your vegetables." Versus, "The thing Big Earl loved the most in the world was his car." Well, big girl and Big Earl, I have a I can feel a slight difference when I say it, but I'm pretty sure if you measured the speech stream and looked at the speech stream, there is very little difference between Big Girl and Big Earl. And yet, we hear that without any problems. Again, we're really using the context of the sentence to help us figure out what the person is saying. And it doesn't feel like there's an ambiguity there. And as I suggested before, so this is really seamless and we don't even notice the problem when we're listening to our own language. Of course, I can tell where words begin and end when somebody's speaking, at least most people are speaking, yeah, even with this co-articulation and the fact that it just all runs together. But listen to another language. This usually is one of my favorite parts because I do get a student to come up and say this in another language. Especially, there's usually a student who is at least somewhat fluent in another language. But because we're doing this online, well, I get to show off my French, but my French is not that good. And so I don't sound like a native speaker, but if you have been to a foreign country, you'll know, you'll remember, right, that it's really difficult. And I remember being in Germany and going to the Netherlands, and I can't remember exactly what I was listening for, but let's just say I was listening for the Bonnenstrasse, or a particular street. And I know that I'm listening for Bohnenstrasse, and that's all I'm listening for, but it's couched in this just like this gobbledygook where I can't tell the beginnings and ends of anything, and it's kind of frightening because you can't pick out the little bit of the speech stream that you truly need in that case. But so if you'll notice as I'm reading, again, I'm not even a native speaker, and so I'm going to have more pauses than a normal native speaker would, and they're going to be between words because of the nature of speech. But so I'm going to do this in French, and you can just listen to, can I tell where words begin and end? If you speak French, you might do okay with this. But j'ai un rêve qu'un jour cette nation se lèvera et vivra le vrai son de sa croyance. Nous tenons les vérités comme allant de soi, que tous les hommes sont créés égaux. Retournez au Mississippi, retournez en Alabama, retournez en Caroline du Sud, retournez en Géorgie, retournez en Louisiane. Okay, and I've picked out these two pieces of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, the I Have a Dream speech, which is one of my favorite speeches, because the beginning is obviously extremely difficult to pick out any words if you don't know the language. But as we get into the retourner au, Mississippi, Alabama, Caroline du Sud, Géorgie, and Louisiane, that you have some idea, right? Because you're looking at it for one, and you know those states, and there's a lot of overlap in the French and how they interpret our words for our states. So those are words that you know enough of that you can kind of, what it's called is bootstrapping, that you can kind of bootstrap into the figuring out, oh, retourner, oh, that must be go back, right? And it's repeating, retourner, retourner. And so as you're bootstrapping, now you have more words, right? You have retourner, and if I use that in a new sentence, it's going to help you to figure out where words begin and end. So how do we actually do this? Well, we are better at figuring all of this out when we are infants, when we are young and we are just learning language. We do have a sensitive period for language and a critical period for language where we stop hearing particular phonemes from. So we are born with the ability to hear any possible phoneme in any possible language. But as we're listening to language, as we're developing, we lose that ability. So if you notice with the Japanese, with the L, R, L, R distinction, that if we are playing those for Japanese infants at the age of 6 months, they can hear the difference between L and R, between the L and the R. But by 12 months old, they're no longer able to distinguish that difference, because that is not a phonemic difference in their language. That is not a meaningful difference in their language. So one of the people who've looked at this ability to perceive breaks between words, Jennifer Safran and her colleagues. So Jennifer Safran's done a lot of work with language acquisition, and she has examined infants' abilities to learn from transitional probabilities, as they are called, or this kind of statistical learning. And I think I talked about this with object recognition and the Bayesian theory, that it looks like we have a lot of statistical learning, a lot of implicit learning, where we are using the probabilities based on our experience with the world. So if we look at infants, these were 6-month-olds, I think, and they were hearing words like bidaku, padoti, golabu, tupiro, and they would hear this in a stream where they were just mushed together just like someone was speaking. So these are 4 non-words that were made up by the experimenters, and they would be repeated over and over again for 2 minutes straight. Bidaku, padoti, golabu, tupiro, padoti, bidaku, and it's hard for me to do, but so they created this so that they were randomly presented, so they would be following each other about a third of the time. So there are 4 of them. So if we look at statistically, what is the infant hearing? Well, da is going to follow B in bidaku 100% of the time. In the example that we have here, and what they gave those kids, they gave those infants, they are making sure that if you notice, that each of those syllables is in one of the 4 non-words. So da follows B 100% of the time. Ku follows da 100% of the time in bidaku. Now, if we look at other transitional probabilities, pa from padoti, it's going to follow the ku of bidaku 33% of the time. Go from golabu is going to follow ku 33% of the time, and tu from tupiro is going to follow ku from bidaku 33% of the time. Are we using these transitional probabilities? How can we use these? So Jennifer Safran and her colleagues, these were actually 8-month-old infants. They examined infants' looking time at whole words from the experiment versus partial words from the experiment. So whole words from the experiment where they are repeating that bidaku, padoti, golabu, tupiro again, versus partial words from the experiment where they were using those same syllables, but they were mix and matching them differently. So they were no longer the words from the experiment, but all of the syllables from the experiment were the same. And I'm going to explain this looking time measure. So what they would do is they would have the infant look at maybe a light or something, and as they were looking at the light, that would cause them to hear the string. The string would be played, the string of words or partial words or whatever, that string would be played as long as they look at the light, and when they look away from the light long enough, it stops playing. So this is giving some indication of their interest. And this looking time measure is pretty typical for how they measure infants' perceptual abilities, because infants habituate. And so if they are listening to these words over and over again for 2 minutes, they're probably not going to be that interested in continuing to listen to those words. They're not going to learn very long. They're not going to look very long at the light in order to listen to those words. But if the partial words were indeed new to them, they're going to look longer. And so if we look at the figure, that's exactly what we see in the whole word condition. When they are doing the experimental part of controlling how long they look at in order to hear those words, they do not look very long in comparison to the partial word condition where they're just repeating syllables. And so this is something new and something novel, and they can tell that. And they can tell that based on the transitional probabilities, and that they've heard this for 2 minutes. That's just 2 minutes, and they can already tell what's a word and what's a new word for them. Another thing that we pick up as we listen to speakers speak, as we listen to the speech stream, is information about speaker characteristics. So gender, age, whether the voice is familiar, dialect, all of that kind of information. One of the studies that has given us some bit of information about how we're picking up information about speaker characteristics is Palmieri, Goldinger, and Pisoni, 1993. So they had listeners, so they would listen to a list of words being said by a speaker, and then later they would have to identify which words were old and which words were new. So they hear a new list of words, but with some old words mixed in there, and they were more rapid. They more rapidly identified a word as old on a list that they had heard before if it was repeated by the same speaker. So it looks like listeners are taking in 2 levels of information about a word as they're listening: its meaning and the characteristics of the speaker's voice. This shows a certain amount of bottom-up processing, right? That we are processing the exact acoustic signal, that when we hear the word signal said by me, that later you're going to recognize that more rapidly said by me, signal, than said by somebody else, because you've taken in that information from a bottom-up kind of way. And of course, we always have top-down processing as well, especially as I've been saying, how much we're listening to context in order to figure out what these speech sounds are and to figure out what people mean. So we know the meanings of words, we have sentences, the context that we've talked about, knowledge of rules and grammar, the background knowledge of the speaker. All of this is going on as we are listening to someone speak. I have already talked about a couple of brain regions that are involved as we're listening to people talk. One is the superior temporal sulcus, as we are imagining to some extent, if you will, the movement of the mouth, and then also the fusiform face area if we are familiar with the speaker, if we know the person who is talking at that moment. The other areas, so the areas that we usually talk about as being involved with speech perception and with language in general, are Wernicke's area, which I'm going to talk about as the mental lexicon, of where we really hold the meanings of the words that we know, and Broca's area. And if you'll notice, this is up in the frontal lobe, on the left frontal lobe in the left hemisphere, and just in front of our motor cortices. So you might hear the shift now that I'm back in the fall with my tired voice and my different laptop, and so I think this is a decent place to stop where I can come back. That this is not my summary slide, but what I'm going to do is go back through the little bit of the history, as I just showed the pictures of the brain where we have that damage to an area that is really close to those motor areas. Pierre-Paul Broca was the person who discovered this. How we used to discover these areas where we really used to figure out this is what's happening is as Broca did with his patient Tan. His patient Tan, when he could understand what people were telling him, but his response to them, so he could perform, tasks and so forth, but his response to them verbally was always Tan, which was how he got that nickname, that he had this really profound amount of damage to this area of his brain that would allow him to put that kind of speech onto the motor movements of being able to move his mouth, to be able to tell you what he's thinking. And so I'll actually show the videos, the YouTube videos, starting on Monday so that we can talk about them, because I love to talk about them, and last semester we did not get to, since I was not doing anything in a synchronous kind of fashion. But we will do that. We'll look at Sarah Scott. And in Wernicke's aphasia, I'm not sure I'm actually going to show this video, but Carl Wernicke was the person who showed us that back in that sort of more temporal area, that this was our mental lexicon, that this is where we kept the knowledge about words and words tied to word meanings. And we will talk about how there's a fluent aphasia, but that they're not really understanding what's going on around them. So we will come back to this on Monday. And I think I'm leaving enough time now here, in fact, maybe a minute earlier so, where you guys can go watch those videos from earlier. And we'll start with these videos on Monday. Have a good weekend.